The wagon wheels groaned against the frozen earth as Clara pressed herself into the corner of the wooden seat, making herself as small as possible, though she knew it was futile. Her father sat beside her, his jaw set tight, refusing to meet her eyes. The mountains loomed ahead like jagged teeth against the pewter sky. "It's done," he said finally, the words emerging in puffs of white breath. "Silas Turner agreed to take you. The debt's cleared." Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She'd heard the whispers in town. The mountain man who'd lost his family to fever 3 winters past, who now lived alone in a cabin so remote that even the circuit preacher wouldn't venture there. They said he was more beast than man now, with hands that could snap a deer's neck and a face carved with scars from fighting a grizzly. But what choice did she have? At 23, she was unmarried and unmarriageable. Harold Beckman had made certain everyone knew why he'd called off their wedding 2 years ago, standing in the church vestibule and announcing for all to hear, "I won't marry something that looks like a sow ready for slaughter." The memory still burned like acid. She'd felt the congregation's eyes on her, had heard the tittering laughs barely concealed behind fans and handkerchiefs. Her mother had wept. Her father had said nothing, then or since, about the cruelty of it. He'd only muttered about the waste of food, the cost of keeping her, the impossibility of finding anyone else willing. Until Silas Turner's letter arrived, the mountain man needed someone to keep house. He'd heard through the trading post owner that the Mitchells had a daughter of age. He'd pay off their gambling debts, $300 more money than Clara had ever seen, in exchange for her service. The word wife had never appeared in the letter, but the implication hung heavy nonetheless. "Don't expect me to fetch you back," her father said, as the wagon crested a ridge. Below them, smoke rose from a chimney attached to a sturdy log cabin nestled in a small clearing. "Whatever happens up here, you made your bed." "I've made nothing," Clara thought bitterly. "I've only ever been told what burden I am." Her father didn't wait for Silas to emerge. He unloaded Clara's single trunk, containing 2 worn dresses, her mother's Bible, and a sewing kit, and drove away without a farewell. The wagon disappeared around the bend, leaving Clara standing in ankle-deep snow, watching her last connection to civilization vanish. The cabin door opened. Clara's breath caught. Silas Turner filled the entire doorway, had to duck his head beneath the frame. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, shoulders broad as an ox yoke, dressed in buckskin and fur. His dark beard grew wild and unkempt, and a vicious scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent half-grimace. His eyes, pale gray like winter ice, swept over her once, revealing nothing. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, his voice a deep rumble. Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard. Smaller? She glanced down at herself, at the body that had earned her nothing but shame. Her dress strained across her bosom and belly, the fabric pulling in ways that made her want to disappear. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered. "I can work hard, I promise. I can cook and clean and—" "Didn't say it was a problem." He stepped past her, lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing, and carried it inside. "Storm's coming. Get in before you freeze." Clara hurried to obey, her skirts dragging through the snow. The cabin's interior surprised her. It was warm, tidy, with well-made furniture and a fire crackling in a massive stone hearth. Furs covered the floor and hung on walls. Dried herbs and strips of venison dangled from the rafters. "You'll sleep there." Silas gestured to a bed in the corner, separated from the main room by a curtain. "I sleep in the loft. There's a root cellar below for storage. Privy's out back, 30 paces. Where? Where would you like me to put my things?" "Wherever you want. It's your space." Your space. The words felt foreign. Clara had never had her own space. Even as a child, she'd shared a room with 3 sisters who'd complained constantly about how much room she took up, how they could hear the bed frame creaking under her weight. "I'll make supper," she said quickly, desperate to prove her worth. "If you'll show me what you have." "Already ate. There's stew in the pot if you're hungry." He moved toward the door, shrugging into a heavy coat. "Need to check the trap line before the storm hits. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it unless you hear 3 knocks, then 2, then 3 again." "You're leaving?" "But you want to eat through winter. I need to check those traps." His pale eyes fixed on her. "Bar the door, Clara. There are wolves in these mountains, and worse things than wolves." He left before she could respond. Clara stood in the center of the cabin, alone in a stranger's home, miles from anyone who knew her name. Slowly, she moved to the door and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. Then she sank onto a bench, carefully, testing its strength first, as she always did, and let herself cry. The storm that Silas predicted arrived that night with a vengeance. Wind howled like tortured spirits, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling in drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls. Clara sat by the fire, jumping at every sound, terrified that Silas wouldn't find his way back. But he returned near midnight, the coded knock cutting through the storm's roar. Clara fumbled with the bar, and Silas pushed inside on a blast of freezing wind, covered head to toe in snow and ice. He looked like a mountain himself, immense and immovable. "Stove's good," he said, stripping off his outer layers. "Storm will last 2, maybe 3 days." Clara had kept the fire burning, kept the stew warm. She ladled him a bowl without being asked, then retreated to her corner while he ate. She'd learned long ago to make herself scarce, to occupy as little space as possible in the presence of men. But Silas glanced at her empty hands. "You eat?" "I'm not hungry, sir." "You're lying." He refilled the bowl and held it out. "Eat." "I shouldn't. Supplies are—" "Plenty of supplies." His tone left no room for argument. "Eat." Clara took the bowl with trembling hands. The stew was rich with venison and root vegetables, thick and savory. She ate slowly, expecting him to watch with disgust or make some comment about her appetite. Harold had loved to do that, loved to count her bites and sigh dramatically. But Silas didn't watch. He busied himself checking his rifles, cleaning snow from his boots, adding wood to the fire. When Clara finished, he took her bowl without comment and set it aside. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "No, sir." "I'll teach you. Can't have you defenseless if I'm gone for any length." He nodded toward the bed in the corner. "Get some sleep. Morning comes early." Clara obeyed, slipping behind the curtain and changing into her nightdress as quietly as possible. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with fresh pine needles and soft pelts. She could hear Silas moving above her in the loft, the creak of timber under his weight. She waited for him to come down, to demand the rights that men claimed over women in their keeping. Harold had made it clear what he'd expected from their marriage bed, had described it in ways that made her skin crawl. But Silas never descended. His movement stilled, and soon she heard the deep, even breathing of sleep. Clara lay awake for hours, confused and wary, waiting for the trap to spring. Days blended into weeks. The storm passed, but winter's grip only tightened, sealing them in a world of endless white. Clara fell into a rhythm, learning the patterns of Silas's life. He woke before dawn to check traps, returned by midday to process pelts and maintain equipment, spent evenings carving or mending by firelight. He taught her to shoot, his big hands adjusting her grip on the rifle, his voice patient as he explained breath control and sight alignment. He showed her which plants in his root cellar were medicinal, how to render fat, how to read weather signs in the sky, and he never, not once, commented on her size. It unnerved her. Clara kept waiting for the cutting remarks, the looks of disgust, the inevitable comparison to livestock. But Silas treated her as he might treat any competent partner, with gruff respect and practical courtesy. More than that, she noticed things, small things. When she served meals, Silas always took smaller portions, leaving the larger share for her. When she mentioned the chair by the fire creaked alarmingly when she sat, he'd simply nodded. She thought nothing of it until the next morning when she found the chair gone, replaced by a massive oak bench with thick legs and a wide seat. "Old chair was falling apart anyway," Silas had said, not meeting her eyes. Then there was the day she'd tried to squeeze past him in the narrow space between the table and the wall, automatically turning sideways and holding her breath as she'd learned to do in her family's crowded house. Silas had simply picked up the entire table and moved it 3 feet to the left. "Better?" he'd asked. Clara had been too shocked to answer. One evening, as Clara mended a tear in one of Silas's shirts, she worked up the courage to ask, "Why did you send for a wife?" Silas's hand stilled on the trap he was oiling. "Didn't send for a wife. Sent for help with the house. But everyone assumes—" "Don't care what people assume." He returned to his work. "A man gets lonely up here. Thought maybe company would be easier." "Then what?" "Then remembering." Clara understood. She'd spent 2 years trying to forget the humiliation of her failed wedding, the pitying looks, the whispered jokes. Some pains didn't heal. You just learned to live around them. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "About your family?" His jaw tightened. "Don't. I just meant, I know what you meant." He set down the trap with deliberate care. "But talking about them won't bring them back. And I can't." He stood abruptly and climbed to the loft without another word. Clara sat alone by the fire, tears sliding down her cheeks for the broken man above her, for the family he'd lost, for all the ways grief could hollow a person out and leave them walking but not living. She understood that too. February arrived with a cold so intense that frost formed on the inside of the windows. Clara woke one morning to find ice crystals on her blankets from her own frozen breath. She dressed quickly, layering every piece of clothing she owned, and hurried to stoke the fire. Silas was already up, boiling snow for water. He glanced at her, frowned. "You're shivering." "I'm fine." "You're not." He crossed to the loft ladder and returned with a massive bearskin. Before Clara could protest, he draped it around her shoulders. The fur was incredibly warm, incredibly heavy, and smelled of cedar and pine. "I can't take your—" "Already got 3 more." He gestured to the loft. "That one's too small for me anyway. Keep it." The bearskin became Clara's constant companion over the following weeks. She wore it like a cape while she worked, wrapped herself in it at night. It made her feel protected in ways she couldn't articulate. One afternoon, while Silas worked outside repairing a shed wall, Clara decided to tackle a project she'd been contemplating. His clothes were falling apart. Shirts worn through at the elbows, trousers split at the seams. He was simply too large for standard garments, and Clara suspected he'd been making do with damaged clothing for years. She pulled out her sewing kit and got to work. By the time Silas returned that evening, stamping snow from his boots, Clara had repaired 3 shirts and reinforced the seams on 2 pairs of trousers. She'd laid them out on his bed, neat and folded. Silas stared at them for a long moment. Then he picked up one of the shirts, examining the careful stitching, the way she'd let out the shoulders to give him more room. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "I wanted to. You've been kind to me. It's the least." "Kind?" He turned to look at her, something raw in his expression. "Clara, I bought you like a piece of property. Your father sold you to clear his debts. There's nothing kind about that. You gave me a home when I had none. You've never—" She struggled for words. "You've never made me feel like a burden. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Silas's throat worked. He set the shirt down carefully as though it might break. "You're not a burden. You make this place feel less empty." "Is that enough?" "It's more than I've had in 3 years." They stood in the firelight, the space between them charged with things neither could name. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to close the distance, to touch him, to offer comfort, or perhaps to take it. But old fears held her frozen. Harold's words echoed in her mind. "Who could want something like you?" Silas seemed to wrestle with his own demons. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then he turned away. "Thank you for the mending," he said roughly, and retreated to the loft. Clara sank onto her bench, the bearskin clutched around her, and wondered how 2 people could be so close and yet miles apart. The next morning, Clara woke to find the chair by the fire gone. In its place sat an enormous wooden armchair, hand-carved from dark oak, with arms wide enough to rest a book on and a seat that could easily accommodate her without strain. The wood was smooth, polished to a soft gleam. Silas was at the table eating breakfast as though nothing was different. Clara approached the chair slowly, running her fingers over the carved scroll work on the arms. "When did you make this?" "Been working on it at night. Thought you needed somewhere comfortable to sit. Silas, this must have taken weeks." "Month and a half." He shrugged. "Had the time. And you?" He set down his spoon, finally meeting her eyes. "You deserve something that fits you, Clara. Something built for you, not made for someone else." Clara's vision blurred with tears. All her life, she'd tried to squeeze into spaces too small, to shrink herself down, to apologize for existing. And here was this rough mountain man, who'd spent weeks carving her a chair that said, "You belong here, as you are." "I don't know what to say." "Don't have to say anything. Just use it." Clara sat down in the chair. It embraced her like a welcome, solid and strong and perfectly proportioned. She felt, for the first time she could remember, that something in the world had been made with her in mind. "It's perfect," she whispered. When she looked up, Silas was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, something fierce and tender at once. Then he grabbed his coat and rifle. "Heading out to the north trap line. Be back by dark." He left quickly, as though fleeing something he couldn't face. Clara sat in her chair for a long time, understanding, blooming like a flower under snow. The chair wasn't just furniture, it was a declaration. It said what Silas couldn't put into words. I see you. I want you to be comfortable here with me. And perhaps, most frighteningly, I'm falling in love with you. March arrived with deceptive warmth, a false spring that melted the top layer of snow and made the forest drip with moisture. Silas warned her it wouldn't last, that the worst storms often came just when you thought winter was beaten. He was right. The blizzard hit on the first Tuesday of March with apocalyptic fury. Snow fell so thickly that Clara couldn't see the shed 30 feet away. Wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing trying to claw its way inside. Silas had gone to check his trap lines that morning, despite Clara's protests. He'd promised to return by noon. By nightfall, he still hadn't come back. Clara paced the cabin, terror mounting with each passing hour. She fed the fire, boiled water, prepared bandages and medicines, anything to feel useful, while her mind conjured horrible scenarios. He'd fallen through ice. A tree had crushed him in the wind. He was lost in the whiteout, freezing to death alone. Near midnight, she heard it. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Clara threw the bar aside and yanked the door open. Silas stumbled inside and immediately collapsed. No, no, no. Clara threw her weight against the door, forcing it shut against the wind. She turned to find Silas on his hands and knees, blood spreading across the floor from his left leg. Tree branch? Fell on it, he managed through gritted teeth. Had to dig myself out. Clara's hand shook as she cut away his trouser leg. The wound was deep, possibly to the bone, and already showing signs of infection, red streaks radiating from the torn flesh. She'd watched her mother tend injuries before, had learned from Silas's own lessons about mountain medicine. She worked methodically, cleaning the wound with boiled water and whiskey, packing it with yarrow and honey, wrapping it tight. Need to get you to bed, she said. Can't make it to the loft. Then the bed down here. Come on. She got her shoulder under his arm, and together they staggered to her bed. Silas was easily twice her weight in muscle alone, but Clara was strong from years of farm work and the labor of simply existing in a body that required strength to carry. She got him onto the mattress, stripped his wet clothes, and piled every blanket and fur in the cabin on top of him. By dawn, Silas was burning with fever. The storm raged on, trapping them inside. Clara couldn't have fetched help, even if there was anyone within 50 miles to fetch. She could only fight to bring down the fever, fight the infection, fight to keep this stubborn, broken man alive. She gave him willow bark tea for the fever, changed his dressings every few hours, trickled water between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. But despite everything, the fever climbed higher. On the second night, Silas began to shake so violently that Clara feared he'd hurt himself. She piled more furs on top of him, but nothing helped. His teeth chattered, his skin was ice despite the raging fever, and his lips were turning blue. She knew what she had to do. The thought terrified her, but there was no other choice. Clara stripped off her dress and shift, standing in only her undergarments. Then she climbed under the furs and pressed herself against Silas's freezing body. He was like ice wrapped in fire, shivering uncontrollably. Clara wrapped her arms around him, pressed her soft belly against his rigid abdomen, entwined her legs with his. She was warm. She'd always run hot, another thing Harold had complained about, and she used every inch of herself to share that warmth. "It's all right," she whispered, stroking his sweat-soaked hair. "I've got you. I'm here." Slowly, infinitely slowly, the shaking began to subside. Silas's arms came up around her waist, pulled her closer with desperate strength. His face pressed into the curve of her neck. "Don't leave," he mumbled, barely conscious. "Please. So cold. You're so warm. I'm not going anywhere." "Missed this," he muttered, his words slurred with fever and delirium. Having someone, missed holding someone. His hands roamed her back, her sides, as though reassuring himself she was real. His touch was reverent, desperate. Clara's breath caught as his palm settled on the curve of her hip. The hip she'd always hated, that jutted out too far, that made dresses hang wrong. "Soft," Silas murmured. "Perfect. Like holding something warm and alive, not cold anymore, not alone." Clara's heart cracked open. In his fever, all his walls were down, and she could see the truth. This strong, gruff man was just as broken as she was, just as desperate for touch and tenderness and belonging. "Silas," she whispered, knowing he probably wouldn't remember, needing to say it anyway. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." His arms tightened around her. "Stay. Please stay. Spring. By spring." "What about spring?" His hand moved to her belly, spread across the soft roundness there. His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with longing. "By spring, you'll birth our son. God, Clara, I want that. Want a family again. Want to see you round with my child. Want to hear a baby cry in this house. Want you in my bed every night. Want," his voice broke, "want someone to love who won't leave me." Tears streamed down Clara's face. "Silas, love this," he mumbled, his hand tracing the curve of her waist, the swell of her hip. "Love holding you, like holding life itself. So much of you to hold, to warm me. Don't want you any different. Want you exactly like this. Perfect." "I'm not perfect," Clara sobbed. "I'm fat and ugly and—" "No." Even in delirium his voice turned fierce. "Beautiful, strong, only good thing I've had in 3 years. Best thing. Want to keep you forever, keep you safe, keep you warm, give you babies, fill this house with your laughter. Please, Clara, please don't leave like they did. Please." He was begging. This giant of a man was begging her to stay, begging her to love him, begging her to give him a future he'd thought was lost forever. Clara pressed her lips to his burning forehead. "I won't leave. I promise. I'm yours, Silas. However you want me, for as long as you'll have me." "Forever," he breathed. "Want you forever." He pulled her closer still, impossibly close, as though he could pull her inside his skin and keep her safe there. Clara held him and let him hold her, two broken people clinging to each other in the heart of winter, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but hope to keep them alive. The fever broke just before dawn. When Silas woke, lucid for the first time in 3 days, he found Clara asleep in his arms, her head on his chest, her body pressed against his length. For a moment he simply stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, processing. Then memory flooded back. Not everything. Fever had burned away much of it, but fragments. The feeling of being held, warmth, Clara's soft body against his, the sound of her crying. What had he said to her? Clara stirred, lifted her head. Her eyes widened when she saw him awake. "You're back," she breathed. "Thank God you're back." "How long?" 3 days. "The fever nearly killed you." Silas became aware that they were both in her bed. that Clara wore only her undergarments, that he was naked beneath the furs. Heat flooded his face. "Clara, did I? You were dying from cold. I had to warm you." She sat up, pulling a blanket around herself. "Don't you dare apologize." "I wasn't going to apologize. I was going to ask—" He stopped, uncertain. "Did I say anything?" Clara's cheeks colored. "You said a lot of things." "Christ!" Silas scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'm sorry. Whatever I said—" "You asked me to stay." Clara's voice was quiet but steady. "You said you wanted a family. You said—" She swallowed hard. "You said you wanted me to birth your son by spring." Silence fell like fresh snow. "Clara, did you mean it?" She turned to face him fully, and he was shocked by the fierceness in her eyes. Or was it just the fever talking? "Because I need to know, Silas. I need to know if there's something real here, or if I'm just convenient, just another piece of property you bought." "You've never been property to me." "Then what am I?" Silas pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain in his leg. He reached out and cupped Clara's face in his calloused hand. "You're the woman who makes me want to come home at the end of the day," he said roughly. "The woman who laughs at my terrible jokes and scolds me for tracking snow inside. The woman who mended my clothes and never asked for anything in return. The woman who's turned this cold house into something that feels like I might deserve to be happy again. Silas, I'm a broken man, Clara. I'm rough and scared, and I don't know how to do this anymore. Last time I loved someone, God took them away, and it nearly killed me. I'm terrified it'll happen again, but I'm more terrified of letting you go." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. "Do you really think I'm beautiful, even like this?" "Especially like this." He traced the curve of her jaw, the softness of her cheek. "You fit in my arms like you were made to be there. You're strong and soft and warm and alive, and every inch of you is perfect because it's you. I don't want you any different. I want exactly who you are. Harold Beckman is a fool who'll die alone, wondering why his life is so empty." Silas's voice turned fierce. "You're worth 100 of him, worth 1,000. Clara launched herself at him, and Silas caught her, wrapping his arms around her as she cried into his shoulder, not tears of sadness, but of relief, of joy, of walls finally crumbling. "I love you," she sobbed. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But I love you, Silas Turner." "Thank God," Silas breathed, "because I love you too. Probably have since the day you first sat in that chair I made and looked at me like I'd given you the moon." They held each other as dawn broke, as the storm outside finally began to ease, as winter's grip started, just barely, to loosen. "So," Clara said eventually, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, "about that son you want by spring?" Silas's ears turned red. "Clara, I mean, if you want to wait—" "I don't want to wait." She took his hand and placed it on her belly, over the soft roundness he'd touched in his fever dream. "I want everything you said. Family, babies, a life together. I want to be your wife, Silas. Really your wife." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Silas pulled her close and kissed her, tender and careful, as though she were something precious. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Then marry me," he said. "No minister, no guests, just us and God and this mountain. Be my wife, Clara. Let me spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." "Yes," Clara whispered. "Yes, yes, yes." 3 months later, as the last snow melted and the first crocuses pushed through the muddy earth. Clara sat in the oak chair Silas had carved for her and watched her husband play with their son. The baby had arrived 2 weeks early, a healthy, squalling boy they'd named Thomas after Silas's father. Clara had labored through the night while Silas paced and prayed, and when Thomas finally emerged into the world, Silas had wept like a child himself. Now he held his son with infinite care, massive hands cradling the tiny body as he walked circles around the cabin, murmuring nonsense and promises. "Going to teach you to hunt," Silas said softly. "Going to teach you to respect this land and the creatures on it. Going to teach you that a man's worth isn't in how loud he talks, but in how he treats the people he loves." Clara smiled, her hand resting on her belly. It would be months before she was ready, but already she thought about giving Thomas siblings. The cabin had been expanded over the winter. Silas had built an addition with a larger bedroom and a nursery. He'd also carved a cradle from pine and a rocking horse for when Thomas was older, and 100 other things born of love and hope. Outside, spring had truly arrived. The world was green and growing, full of possibility. Silas came to sit on the wide bench beside Clara's chair, the two pieces of furniture positioned side by side like thrones. He kept Thomas in one arm and wrapped the other around Clara's shoulders, pulling her close. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Clara said honestly. "You?" "Terrified every day that I'll wake up and find it's a dream," Silas admitted. "But yes, happier than I deserve." "You deserve everything good, Silas Turner." Thomas made a small, contented sound, already falling asleep in his father's arms. Through the open door, they could hear bird song and the rush of the creek, swollen with snowmelt. Clara thought about the girl who'd arrived here in deepest winter, expecting cruelty and finding kindness instead. She thought about the man who'd been so broken he'd forgotten how to live, until someone gave him a reason to try again. They'd both been deemed unworthy by the world, too fat, too scarred, too different, too damaged. But here, in this cabin on this mountain, they'd built something the world couldn't touch. A family, a home, a love that asked for nothing but to be itself. "By spring, you'll birth our son," Silas had begged in his fever dream. Clara looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in his father's arms, at the man who'd moved mountains to make her feel worthy, at the life they'd created together against all odds. The mountain man had begged, and the obese girl had answered, and they'd both found salvation in each other's arms.